Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Marco Davis. I'm the Deputy Director of the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for Hispanics, and it's a pleasure to welcome all of you today to the third in our series of Bright Spots in Hispanic Education Google Hangouts, aimed at highlighting the good work that organizations are doing across the nation to reduce the achievement gap for Hispanics. As you may recall, as part of our 25th anniversary year of action, our initiative made a national call for bright spots in Hispanic education and announced over 230 organizations, programs, and initiatives that are working to increase educational achievement for Hispanics. To elevate the work of these bright spots and learn from their experience, our initiative is hosting a series of interactive discussions on educational topics of interest via the Google Hangout platform over the coming year. Today's session will provide an opportunity to hear from some of our bright spots and discuss ways to continue moving the needle for Latino students and families in the area of post-secondary completion. I'm joined by my colleague Beatriz Ceja, who is the Hispanic Serving Institution Division Director at the U.S. Department of Education. She will serve as our subject matter expert, and I'm also joined by 8 bright spot organizations throughout the country who lead efforts to increase post-secondary completion in the Hispanic community. They are the folks in the boxes at the bottom of the screen. And as you're watching from left to right, they include Dominican University in River Forest, Illinois. Wave your hands. Whoops, sorry, that's not the order. I got that wrong. From left to right, first we have Rutgers University LSAMP program. Great. Followed by Meritus College. They're based in San Francisco, California. We have the LASER program at Ohio State University. Hey, everybody. We then have Mercy College, who's in Dobbs Ferry, New York. We have a great group from Mercy. We have the Scholars Latino Initiative in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Hi, everybody. We have Dominican College in River Forest, Illinois. We have the University of California, Riverside in Riverside, California. And finally, we have the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, or UTRGV, based in Edinburgh, Texas. Thanks, it's great. We would also like to welcome all of you who are viewing this event over the internet via live stream. We want to thank you for joining us today. Now, before we begin, I want to give my colleague Bea a minute to share a few updates from her office and about the work that the Office of Post-Secondary Education does at the U.S. Department of Ed.
Thank you, Marco. And I want to also echo Marco's welcome to you and gratitude for joining us today. As mentioned, I oversee the Hispanic Serving Institutions Programs Division in the Office of Post-Secondary Education, which provides over $7 billion, that's right, I said billion, in funding to support institutional improvement and provide student services with the purpose of ensuring college access and completion. My office is specifically responsible for 3 discretionary grant programs totaling over $2 million, which include approximately 282 grants. These 3 grant programs include the Title V, Developing Hispanic Serving Institutions, the Post-Baccalaureate Hispanic Serving Institutions Program, and the Hispanic Serving Institutions STEM and Articulation Program, which will actually be having a funding opportunity this year, which I will provide further details later in this hangout. Some of the bright spots you'll hear from today have secured grant funding from our office. I'm happy to share that we will be having, again, some funding opportunities. And hopefully these bright spots will serve as examples of ways in which you can use some of our appropriated funds. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Bea. And again, she is a wealth of information. That's why she's joining us today as our subject matter expert. And so we look forward to your insights and your contributions during our discussion today. I want to remind everyone that you can also participate in the discussion by submitting your questions to us or to some of the presenters via Twitter using our handle @HispanicEd, or using the hashtag HigherEd. You can also submit questions to us on our Facebook page by simply searching for White House Initiative on Facebook, or by emailing us at whieeh@ed.gov. whitehouse.ed.gov. That's WHIEEH at ed.gov. Now let's get started by learning about the Bright Spot organizations who are here with us today. So let's start, again, left to right. Let's start with Rutgers University. Tell us briefly about your organization and the program that's recognized as a Bright Spot.
Okay, thank you. What our program is the Garden State Lewis Stokes Alliance for Minority Participation. We started this program in 2009, and the goal of the first phase of this is to double the number of underrepresented minority students in 5 years. We achieved that in 4 years. So we've done very well. We've expanded greatly. We graduate now over 1,000 students. We had tremendous increase, especially in the Hispanic Latino population. And as a result, we now connected with 5 community colleges, all of which are HSIs, Hispanic Serving Institutions. And we now have a program for these community college students to be transferred, into the 4-year schools once they're finished with their associate's degree very quickly and easily. We have programs where they do research at our campuses, and so we graduate people very, tremendous speed and are effective in that regard.
Great, thank you very much. Now let's turn it over to Meritus College. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your work?
Hi, and thank you. Meritus is a community-based organization in San Francisco, and we have been serving our community for 20 years. And our model is based on a holistic approach to serving our students. It starts with a meaningful scholarship that accompanies our students through to graduation. And coupled with that, we also provide one-on-one college advising so that our students feel like they're academically prepared, that they have the moral support, that they have the skills necessary to succeed in college so that they can be real self-advocates for their future and for their success. And we also provide a career development component to our work because for us, college is really a means to the next step in life. In addressing socioeconomic mobility, I think our program is really well positioned to help our students look at the long term and think of a long time horizon for their future, for their families, and for their community.
Great, thank you very much. Now let's hear from the laser program at Ohio State.
Yeah, so we're focused on creating a pipeline for students beginning in 9th grade through 12th grade. We have undergraduates that work intensively with them on a weekly basis to get them college ready. Every student that has been in our program has gotten into either a 4-year college or a 2-year community college and then transferred. But we also work very closely with the Multicultural Center, Undra Leva, who's just here to my right, and also part of the laser team, because it's not just about getting the students to college, it's about creating an environment that allows them not just to survive, but to thrive. So we work very closely with other units on the campus, both at the undergraduate levels and also at the graduate levels. One of my colleagues here, also part of the laser team, graduate student, and we also have an undergraduate representative from the laser team and another graduate student and coordinator of laser. So it's a pipeline that starts in 9th grade and really goes all the way through graduate and professional schools, and with even mentoring happening between faculty, so senior faculty and junior faculty.
Great, thank you very much. And now let's turn it over to Mercy College in New York.
Hi, Mercy College is an HSI serving more than 10,000 students in the New York City area. We have campuses in Dobbs Ferry and Yorktown Heights, and also in Manhattan and the Bronx. We know that our Latino graduates will play a crucial role in the future of America's workforce and its global competitiveness in the knowledge economy. So our faculty and staff are overwhelmingly concerned with how we see that Mercy College graduates don't just accumulate a few college credits and a lot of college debt, but how they cross the finish line and earn a degree from Mercy College with the lowest possible debt. So our faculty and staff are committed to finding new ways to help support the learning and success of our students, and we're proud to be a part of this conversation today.
Wonderful, thank you. And so now let's go on to the Scholars Latino Initiative out of UNC.
Thanks, Marco. Scholars Latino Initiative at UNC Chapel Hill really does something, simply put, is to help Latino students not just make it to college, but thrive. We do that through a pipeline of programs and a variety of programming within that pipeline that really begins in high school, because we believe post-secondary success doesn't begin when you enter college, it begins way before that. And so through this programming, we provide academic coaching, leadership development, as well as creating support networks that really enable our students to understand where to ask for help and where to access resources. SLI spans outside of UNC Chapel Hill, and through our support of a variety of high schools and our alumni, once they graduate our program, we also support institutions across the state that where our students end up enrolling. They know where to ask for help and always continue to come to SLI because they know that there's a community here that really seeks to enable Latino student success.
Great, thank you very much. And now let's go on to Dominican University in Illinois. Sheila, I think you're muted. We can't hear you.
Thank you, Marco. First of all, I want to say what a great joy it is to be with all of these colleagues that are bright spots in this very, very important work of ensuring that Latinos graduate from college. For Dominican University, which has a population of 696 students, and at Dominican, 47% of our population is Latino, and over 50% of our population is first generation. We are very, very concerned that these students who have been marginalized in society have the opportunity to succeed. This is not a program, this is actually a campus-wide commitment to ensuring that Latino students succeed. We have the right leadership that constantly talks about new ways and encourages us all to be innovative. We have the mindset so that students will complete. We have a laser-like focus on college completion, and we are developing the skill set. And things that we're doing that I just want to say briefly is it's very, very important to welcome our students and their families to campus. It's extremely important to advise for student success, to get peers involved, and to encourage engagement. So we're very glad to be here today.
Great, thank you very much. And now let's go on to UC Riverside in California.
Thank you, Marco. UC Riverside has been acknowledged for closing the gaps in graduation rates between ethnic groups. We are an HSI serving institution. We buck the current trends by having students both in the African American populations and Hispanics graduating at the average of the university, exceeding most research universities in the country. We have a number of initiatives that have been in place for a number of years, including an HSI STEM grant funded by the U.S. Department of Education. Thank you very much. Money coming. That particular program in the last few years has partnered with community colleges to establish programs to encourage students to continue in STEM careers past community college to get 4-year degrees, with the goal of closing the achievement gap all the way up into the professional ranks. We also are an LS-AMP institution now in its 25th year here, and over those 25 years we have supported over 3,000 students in our programs, and the LS-AMP program, known as California Alliance, system-wide has shown substantial gains in closing those gaps and having students go on to graduate school. We also have initiatives in all of our colleges. We just recently were awarded a Mellon Mays undergraduate fellowship program last year in our College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. We have robust learning communities which engage all of those students, all aimed at increasing student success in all groups on this campus.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And then finally, definitely not last but not least, let's go to UTRGV, the University of Texas at Rio Grande Valley.
There we go. All right. So UTRGV is a new institution. We launched in September 2015, brand new. We are a consolidation of the University of Texas Pan American and the University of Texas in Brownsville. Our two main campuses are in Edinburgh and Brownsville, Texas, on the Texas-Mexico border. We've got 28,600 students, and 89% of them are Hispanic. So serving Hispanic students is the central part of our mission and our reason for existence. For those students, 78% of them are on Pell. So serving Hispanic students who come from poverty, particularly persistent poverty experience, is also part of our mission. Prior to our launch, and since that time, we have worked hard to prioritize and develop programs in experiential learning. We've developed programming in mentored research experiences for undergraduate students, service learning experiences, volunteerism, student leadership development. Federal support through the Developing Hispanic Institutions Fund has been incredibly helpful for that. We now have an active annual undergraduate research conference with hundreds of students participating. We have an active undergraduate service learning showcase in which hundreds of students participate. We've had really enthusiastic support of our campus and our community and our students in participating in those experiences. And it just goes to show you that no matter how high we set our expectations for our students, they meet those expectations and ask us to move it higher.
Great, great. Thank you very much. Well, viewers, as you can tell, we have really a real wealth of expertise, of knowledge, of information, of best practices that are here that we're going to hear from, and so we're very excited to get into this conversation. Now, I will tell you all ahead of time that I plan to jump around a bit. I don't want to go each time left to right. I think that is not very creative. So we're going to jump around sort of based on relevance, based on topics, sort of based on where we make connections, but we assure you that you're going to hear from all of the presenters throughout the course of our Hangout today. So first what I want to do is actually come to Dominican University. And Sheila, one of the things I wanted to ask you about is I know that, for one, Dominican University has a history of serving, for example, immigrants, first-generation college students. And it's my understanding that you have had a pretty substantial growth in the Latino student population. I think in some ways that reflects, and it's even, I think, more accelerated even than the growth of the Latino population in the U.S. So I'm wondering sort of how the university sort of adapted and responded to that growth. I think your population, your Latino student population, maybe doubled in the last 5 to 10 years. Share with us a little bit about sort of the resources that you either already had or that you put in place to support the students who are there to help them, again, not just enroll, but in fact to complete college and maybe even move into careers. Talk with us a little bit about your work.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's really important to understand the mission of Dominican University. And our mission has historically been to ensure that students who may be marginalized, whether they're immigrant students or whether they're women or whether they're students of color, would have a chance to succeed here. So there is a mindset that we need to do. Well, whoever walks through the door, we need to ensure that they have the opportunity for the best education possible. And that means that we meet on a weekly basis from the cabinet to various what our students are doing. We look at early warning systems to determine what it is that they're experiencing in the classroom. We begin to think about how to engage students as peer advisors and peer leaders so that they can help our students continue to rise to the occasion and stay on track. And so the most important thing for us is to never give up on students and to support them in any way possible, because we know we're going to be asked, what is it? What have you done to make certain that that student succeeds? And we know that we're going to be asked that by our colleagues and by our leadership. So that's the most important part. We're constantly looking to innovate.
That's great. That's great. Thank you very much. And so following along a track in my mind, so that's great that you're sort of positioned to be supportive for students and to be welcoming and to sort of really lend a hand to students. One of the things we know that comes up, top, if not first, on almost every kind of question about accessing college, and certainly about persisting and completing college, is of course finances, right? So what I want to do now is actually turn to Meritus College Fund, because I think in many ways you all are not your typical scholarship fund. You award funds for sure, but it seems like you have a broader array of supports and services for students. And so I'd like if you could share a little bit about what you've learned that other schools, other institutions, other organizations could learn from in terms of what you provide that goes beyond the dollars, which of course we know are really essential.
Right, thank you. Meritus is really intent on meeting a student where they are, understanding who they are as individuals, understanding what their goals are, understanding their families and the communities that they come from. And so we work one-on-one very closely with our students through to college graduation. We have staff that are our college advisors, our college success advisors. They work with our students to, in the first instance, make a college choice, really looking at financial aid letters, understanding what the campus is like, how they can thrive there, and helping guide them through that really critical phase post high school graduation, really, where we talk about summer melt. We have all of our students getting into stepping foot on campus as freshmen, which we think is a major accomplishment just from the start. But from there, we really connect our students with resources on their campus, with older Meritus scholars who can serve as buddies to help them navigate. We help them really identify the resources on campus. We're there as their cheerleaders. We want to help them celebrate successes. We want to help them also overcome hurdles. We think our students sometimes struggle with that sense of belonging on a college campus, where they may be different, they may not fit in right away, but helping navigate the system, helping them identify opportunities so that they can thrive is really what we excel at. And we do try to understand what our students' goals are for the long term so that we can really be a thought partner with them. It really is up to the student to help make some of those decisions. We are here to guide and to be colleagues with them, to support them all the way through to the next phase of their lives. Again, college is a terrific stepping stone to careers and to postgraduate studies, and we're here really to help them think that through and to create opportunities where at all possible.
If I could just interject here, one of the things that I keep hearing from all these programs is intentionality. And so if the folks out there are making a list of the ingredients that really help to support students through completion, I think these programs are truly providing you with some of those key ingredients are definitely mindset, as mentioned earlier, focus, the financial support, but not just financial support, but coupled with counseling, looking at the social supports needed. So everything with true focus and intentionality. So, Marco?
That's great. That's great. Thank you for mentioning it, Bea. I think that's right, and I think you'll see that throughout the conversation. I want to turn now to Mercy College in New York. One of the things I know that is indicative of your program that I think you attribute to your success, one is your Personalized Achievement Contract program, the PACT program, I think you refer to it. And I think there's also a component that I wonder if you could share about making connections to the community, going beyond the campus and bringing the community in to help enhance the experience for students. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, we have a series of strategies that we've been carrying out over the last several years and expect to go into the future. I'm going to mention 5 parts of those strategies. We call them the Maverick Success Toolkit. You may see the Maverick here in the back. That's our school mascot. The toolkit consists of a number of things, but I'll just focus quickly on 5. First, as we've heard from Dominican, we have a mindset. I call it a mission-driven mindset. We don't believe that the pathway to better completion rates is simply to accept fewer at-risk students. We believe that if we're in the business of serving the students that we have, and if we can help them succeed, that we will have failed. So we have that mindset at work. Second, we are really focused on teaching excellence and faculty-student engagement. because we know that completion without learning is a sham. We also know that our faculty connections with our students is one of the most important resources we have in helping our students hang tough and go all the way through the college career towards a graduation. Third, we've allocated significant resources to mentoring, as you were just mentioning. We provide every one of our undergraduate students with a professional mentor who works with our students to help navigate through the pathway all the way through college, from financial aid and registration in the very beginning to thinking about careers at the very end. When we first put this practice in 2009, we saw a 10 percentage point increase in our retention rates. Fourth, we're redesigning remedial courses. We know that many of our students come to us with deficiencies in the area of mathematics and English, and we also know that the way remedial courses have worked for a generation in this country is really the graveyard of college completion. So we are redesigning those courses along prerequisite models so that students are plunged immediately into the college credit-bearing courses with just-in-time support to allow them to succeed in those courses. And then finally, in our immediate horizon is the notion that we're going to use choice architecture to help simplify the choices that our students have to make. So next year, for the first time, we will be putting a large portion of our freshmen into cohorts so that they will form informal social bonds in the course of their classroom activity that we think will help them to stick at college better. And then we'll also be developing guided pathways to success, where we elaborate very specific pathways and then make sure that our students know what the pathway is, and then we can evaluate whether students are on it or off it and give them appropriate support. We're also working on connecting with our community, and you may hear a little bit more from that as we go along.
Great. I think that's a great sort of menu there of supports and services that are key, that are important. One of the things we've also learned, I think, is in many ways I've heard folks in higher ed often talk about the fact that essentially if we wait until the student sets foot on the campus that first day, we're sometimes already too late. That really the most effective way to ensure not just access but completion is really to start before that. And so I want to turn to Laser, if I could, and ask you all to talk a little bit about your mentoring program, because my understanding is that you reach down into the high schools and even I think even into middle schools to help really sort of start building that pathway for students long before they get onto your campus. So can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so as many of us know, the Midwest and the South are the areas where Latino demographics are growing the fastest. Mm-hmm. Here in the Midwest at The Ohio State University, our experience has been in the community and in high schools, already starting, of course, in elementary schools, is that the infrastructure is not equipped to allow for success when it comes to Latino students. It could be things like lack of bilingual resources, teachers, lack of counselors, all the way through, but it's also a mindset and a narrative. You guys brought up mindset. It's not that there aren't good people out there, it's just that they have never had to think about Latinos before. Mm-hmm. So part of our mission, or part of our program has been to go as deep into the sort of earlier educations as we can. We aren't limitless in our resources, so we've been moving into middle school, especially with the siblings of those who are in the high school Laser program. But those have been very successful. So that's kind of where we're at. It also includes some of the other elements that everyone has been talking about, bringing the parents to campus, having a Pan Dulce night, having a FAFSA workshop night where the students don't leave until the FAFSA is completed. Other things, but I can also hand this over really quickly. Maybe we have, for instance, Intraleva has started an initiative here through the Multicultural Center to actually have an orientation for Latino freshmen. Did you want to say something?
So we're working on that to actually create a stronger community, also to create the connections between undergrad students and upper level undergraduate students with the freshmen and also with transfer students. So we're working on that because we're seeing an increasing number of Latinos coming into the university.
Great.
Great. Thank you. And in fact, the folks at Laser just mentioned, you know, this issue, this new concern about sort of growing populations in new areas, and so for that, I wanted to turn over to Sly down at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, because you all, I know, also are sort of what we like to refer to at the initiative as sort of an emerging community, a place that's experiencing new and recent and sometimes very significant growth in Latino population. It's a place that hasn't historically had large Latino population. So I wonder if you all could share a little bit about sort of the social supports, about some of the ways in which you acknowledge and help support the identity formation of the students who come to your campus.
No, absolutely, and you got it absolutely right. The demographics in North Carolina have quickly been transforming over the last 2 decades, and we're really seeing that firsthand in our educational system. And so, simply put, Sly's in the business of creating social and cultural capital, and I think that's really key to get our students through high school, into college, and to succeed in college. And so, some of the support systems that we really create are formal through engagement with institutions like UNC, but so much of it is informal, like the mentors that you see behind me. They all play a key role in really engaging with students beginning in high school and really carrying them through 3 years of life together, where by the time they're graduating from high school, so are our mentors. And while our formal programming ends there, the informal support networks continue thriving. So many of our students go on to their professional careers and continue mentoring them through their college careers. The second part of this is acknowledging that the informal support networks isn't enough, of course. The institutional support, like we've heard from so many institutions here, is critical. And so with SLY, we're also looking to acknowledge what it looks like to support students in their first and second year of college, where they really do need that skill building and life skill support, and then help them with the goal setting and their planning for their future the same way we did in high school by connecting them to graduate school. I think the whole idea of being able to see yourself in a position later in life is really key to help continue these students going. So when we talk about identity formation, it's really powerful to be able to see a diverse group of students like the ones you see behind me for our high school students and college students, and be able to show them that, yeah, there are students like you who will continue persisting through college and to future professionals.
That's great, great. Thank you very much. And so one of the things we also know is that even as we've heard from a number of the presenters already, there is a need to support the students once they get there, to help them navigate through that intentionality, the mentoring, etc. Even with all of those supports ready to go and in place, we know that unfortunately there's still a number of students who arrive to college frankly not yet college ready, right? They end up needing to be referred to either remedial education, they need additional supports in order to be able to persist and to succeed. And so I want to turn to UT RGV, that even though you're a new campus, I know that that's something that you've worked to address consciously and deliberately. So I'm wondering, what are some of the measures you all take when you have that first incoming cohort of students, and some of them are needing sort of that extra support, that added support, in order to get them, frankly, on track towards graduation?
Okay, perhaps the most fundamental thing about our approach to working with students who aren't yet college ready is that we really do believe that all students who are admitted to UT RGV are capable of doing college level work and succeeding. And that's really important. It seems like something that you should say, of course, but I think it's really fundamental to what we do. And so we approach all of our students as scholars capable of doing incredible work if we give them the kind of support that we need. And part of that involves having really high expectations for them, rigorous curriculum, and really strong faculty who work for them. And we've seen for many years now that our students really do rise to those expectations. And so there are three main things that we do. The first one is in response to a relatively new law in Texas. We've created college prep courses in English and math for high school seniors they've passed their state mandated exams, but they're still not college ready. And so our approach has been unique in that we've employed a regional strategy where we work with all of the higher eds in the Valley and over 35 local school districts to design these courses that give students individualized feedback and, again, just-in-time feedback on their work, so that hopefully by the time they graduate from high school, they'll be college ready. And we've been able to provide professional development for those teachers and other resources. And the one thing that we're really proud of is that this course has a zero cost for our school districts. So that's really, really important in the Valley in particular. And another success that we've experienced is our Jumpstart Summer Bridge program. And this program is required for all of our incoming students who are not yet college ready, but they've been admitted. So they come in the summer and they take a course with us. Sometimes if they're not college ready in all of the areas, they take 2 courses with us. And we recruit our best teachers. I think this is another key thing that we do, is not putting the least prepared teacher into the course with the students who need developmental ed. And so we design a curriculum that will lead them directly into their first credit-bearing course. And a key feature of this, and our pass rates are in the 80 percentile range, so they're very high, and something they're really excited about is we have embedded tutors and embedded peer mentors in this program. So they work with them on everything that's happening in the class, and then they're also helping them sort of navigate the institution as well. And then finally, as one of the other institutions mentioned, we have a long history of doing co-requisite developmental education. In English, we've been doing it probably more than 7 years. And again, our pass rates in that area are anywhere from 82 to 90%, so something very exciting. And during the long semesters, we offer nothing but co-requisite developmental education. So everyone has to go through that. Again, they're doing the work of the credit-bearing class. We have really good teachers that we put into those classes, and we support them as an institution in continuing to learn how it is that they can use their disciplinary expertise to teach students who are in transition and who have historically struggled in one of those areas.
That is great. Thank you very much. That's, I think, a really great summary and overview sort of all the different work that you do. And I really want to appreciate and acknowledge sort of your comment about the expectations at the outset of your remarks, because your response, because that's something we see and know about. That's a critical factor it's talked about in the K-12 space, but I'm not sure how much that's discussed in higher ed. And I think, like you said, I mean, once you say it, people sort of say, of course, but I think it absolutely bears saying for folks to be deliberate and explicit, and in fact to communicate that message to the students, right, so that students understand that that folks have those high expectations for them, rather than, I think, sometimes intentional or unintentional, the sort of sink or swim mentality that sometimes is the message that students get when they get to higher ed, the idea that they have to sort of, produce, or it may be too much for them. So thank you for that, absolutely. So we've heard from a number of the presenters, and we've sort of really talked about sort of getting folks on track, but now, as folks have mentioned and alluded to, the idea is obviously not just getting them to college, not just getting them to stay in college, but to finish and in fact go on to that next step. Into careers that are going to help them support their families. And so what I want to do now is turn over to Rutgers University, because you all, I think, are really tapping into a need that our economy, that our nation, that society really has, which is sort of the STEM fields, right? And you all have had, from what it sounds like, you've had some really tremendous success in really helping Latino and other students get into STEM careers, STEM majors, complete their STEM majors, even go on to advanced degrees. So talk to us a little bit about what it is you've done to be able to sort of really produce those really great results and increase dramatically the number of students going into STEM majors and onto STEM careers.
Okay, thank you. Well, the big thing is for Rutgers Newark has been ranked the most diverse college or university in the United States ever since the category existed. So for 18 years, we've been the most diverse campus. In addition, we're an emerging HSI. So there's a lot of stuff on campus already to help students through. So what we wanted to do was to pinpoint certain areas to help people through. And I'm going to just talk about 2 of them that we really have found to be very useful. And the first one is that there's 3,500 LSAMP scholars in the whole program, and another 600. So we have a lot of students. So what we wanted to do was to try to get programs where we could, because we can't give them such individualized attention. So we have found programs, especially using online availability of programs to try to help these students. So one of the things we used was we vet these programs, we find out how they can best serve our students, and we put them in place. So one of them places obviously is math. So what we found was we modified this Alex online program, and we took a bunch of students. We started out with 28 here, and they all with a 1.8 GPA. We gave them a short summer program, and the next semester they had a 3.45 in math. And in fact, I have one student here who's Tricia DeFritis, who just went through the program, so you can tell them how that helped you.
Hi, everyone. A little bit more about the program. I really was bad at math. I'm one of those persons that do not like math at all. So I failed pre-cal twice before I knew about this program. And I recently just took pre-calc again. But before I took pre-calc, I took the program over the summer. It was 6 weeks long. And I was here on campus, even though it was online. I felt like I was still in a school environment because I was a summer RA. So I took the class or the program over the summer, and then I went straight into pre-calc that next semester, and I passed with a B+. That was like the moment I was so happy passing with that grade. So it really helped me to just improve the way I looked at math instead of just thinking, oh, I don't like math, I really hate this, how math is. But it made me appreciate math more, the way the program was set out. And it made me understand it more, and in that way I did really good, and I got a B+. So it really helped a lot.
So that's one of the things, and the other thing we use a lot is to get students involved in research experiences. And in fact, between the LSAMP and the B2B, we sponsored 262 research experiences. 65 of them were where we took community college students and brought them onto college campuses to do research with faculty. And at the end, then they present their their findings at a conference, a research conference at the end of the year. And in fact, we had Senator Cory Booker came and gave the keynote. We had 1,000 people, and I want to have Luciana Lantigua, who participated in it, tell you about that.
So I had the opportunity to do research ever since my second semester in high school, and right now I'm in my second semester of my junior year. I'm in college. So I already been doing research for about 2 years now. Not only was I exposed through it through the LSAM program, but I actually got to present and get a lot of feedback. So then I'll go back to research the next semester. I'll be able to improve what I did wrong and hopefully get published. So not only was the exposure to research great for me because I got to see what I like, what I don't like about research, but it helps build my career already from in college. Like I'm able to get published and put down my resume, and continue my interest field.
Great, and in a few years, you can teach at one of these universities.
Yeah, that's the plan.
Thank you. I believe Marcos is going to lead us into our next speaker.
Yeah,
also.
yeah. And one last thing I wanted to mention. Thank you for bringing up and talking about the involvement of students in research. Rutgers. I know that UTRGV also actually does some work with. They have an Office of Undergraduate Research, and so we might come back to them in a little bit to share a little bit more about how that sort of helps enhance the experience. But before we do that, we've got one more presenter who hasn't yet gotten a chance to speak, and I've sort of saved them for last because in some ways, looking at some statistics, this campus may have what some might say have figured it out. According to the data that we've received, it seems that University of California Riverside has in fact achieved parity in graduation rates. You mentioned that even at the beginning in your introductions. And so I wanted to turn it over to you and to ask you all about sort of what it is you think that was sort of the magic ingredient. You've closed the graduation gap between Latino students and white students. And is there things that jump out at you from the comments that all the different bright spot groups just mentioned, or is there something added and extra that folks need to keep in mind? Like, what is it that helps round out that menu of ingredients, as Bea was talking, that has helped you really achieve that success that other schools and other organizations could really learn from and incorporate into their work?
Okay, thank you, Marco. I think the first thing to realize is that there is no such thing as a magic bullet. That it really takes a number of partnerships working together in concert if you truly aim to succeed. And so this has not been a short-term effort. This has been an effort that has gone on ever since really UCR was founded. It has valued diversity from its beginnings. It has, for a long time, been an HSI serving institution, as well as an institution that values all cultures within it. And so, you know, understanding that there are differences in student preparation, difference in cultures, and using that truly as recognizing that as power and not as a deficiency, but understanding that there are differences, I think, is a key starting point. So, to my left, I have a number of people who have taken various pieces of this puzzle working together, and so I would like them to share briefly their parts of this puzzle.
So, one of the big challenges for first-generation students is that first year, because they're coming out of homes and families where they haven't had too many people to talk to about what it takes to be successful, not just in college, but in particular in demanding STEM majors. And so we focused a lot on the freshman students and getting them off on the right start so they don't stumble that first year. And we've done that by running freshman learning communities for many years now, where we put the freshmen in groups of 24, and we give them a lot of support to help them gel into basically a self-supporting family, an academic family, if you will, that helps them survive that first year. And the components of this are each important, and I'm not sure which of them I could single out, but it's the combination or the constellation that's important. So these 24 students are enrolled in the same class all year long in their freshman year. So they're spending a lot of contact time together, and that turns out to be very important. They bond and form a self-supporting network by doing that. So that those contact hours, you know, you might be in a class of 500 students, but the same 24 students are there with you all at that time, and you form a social group. We give them peer tutoring in those classes, and that turns out to be very important. 2 hours a week of peer tutoring with a junior or senior who's been successful in that class, that's a role model for you right there to look at, and you can say, I want to be that person in 2 years. And that's very important, and the students report to us that they really like the peer mentoring a lot. We put them in contact with a faculty member in this small group of 24 students, so they get to learn what UC faculty are like, and that they are not just focused on teaching, but they're very focused on research, and it's really important for a first-generation student to understand that about UC faculty at a Tier 1 research institute. We give them an hour a week of very focused academic advising, so they get to learn to know and trust their academic advisor, and that makes them more likely to go to that advisor if they start finding themselves in difficulties later on. And then finally, and this is the component that I think probably has the most long-term impact, we give them a taste of doing research in their freshman year. We've heard many of the other institutions talking about that. That experience in doing research at a Tier 1 university really helps cement their interest in the subject matter, and it reinforces their confidence in their ability to go on to graduate school or a professional school and go on into a profession. And that's really important. And so the net effect of these freshman learning communities over the several years we've been piloting is they're starting to produce graduation rates of 60 to 65% in STEM, for example. These are 5-year graduation rates. With our population of students who are more than 50% first generation and almost 50% Pell Grant eligible. So I think the freshman year efforts have been important, and then we've had several other support programs in their later years that also add to this whole constellation that we think is working.
That's great. Awesome. Thank you very much.
Maria, would you like to talk a little bit about some of our other support programs?
Absolutely. So once that has been explained, students start the research very early on. When they come to me, between, it's a program that has been in existence. We're going to be celebrating our 29th year. So we think we have it figured out. And it's a great program because not only it has served as a leveraging component for other programs on campus. So the students who conduct research during the summer for a period of 8 weeks, but not only are they paired with a faculty mentor, we take it a little bit further, and we have mandatory GRE preparation classes as well as professional development weekly courses. The program differs a little bit in that there's more accountability. The students have paid a stipend And if they don't attend the classes, then their stipend will be docked. So that's a great incentive right there for the students to attend. But in terms of the students who have gone on to pursue graduate degrees, and this will, some of course invariably will seek out a professional degree, medical or law, but my calculations for the 29 years, about 89% have gone on to pursue PhDs. And I think this is thanks to the programs like Dr. McKibben to my right just mentioned, that they start very early on. And when you expose the students to research, and then it's just the light bulb goes on, so to speak, that just ignites that passion for research, they're more likely to stay on with the program. And, some will love it, and some will just say, this is not for me. But regardless, that will be an investment of 8 weeks versus having begun graduate studies and then having to drop that. But, we have, I have to just give thanks to all the faculty who are so invested in our students, and they're so approachable, and they make us feel so at home, and they're so willing to share in their knowledge.
Great, great. Thank you very much. So we're going to need to advance a little bit because we've got just a few minutes left here before the hour is up, and it's clear that folks at UC Riverside have a really, really robust set of services and supports, and I want to make sure that folks think about one of the pieces that I did mention at the top of the hour is folks should really think about engaging these institutions, reaching out, and the organizations, and reaching out to them to learn more about the programs. One of the pieces, one of the ideas behind this Google Hangout is for you all to just get even just a sampling, if you will, of the great work that they all do to help really build some of that peer networking, peer learning. So we encourage folks viewing, we encourage the presenters to connect with each other, to talk more in depth, to sort of learn what kinds of things you can adapt, ways that folks may have solved some of the issues or instituted programs that you may want to bring to your community, to your campus, and so on. I think would be a really great thing to do, and that's part of the purpose of this Google Hangout. Yeah. I wanted to turn it back over to my colleague B, in fact, and ask you a little bit about first, if from what you heard, if there's anything that jumped out at you, given all of your knowledge and expertise working with institutions of higher ed, both now in Hispanic serving institutions and even before, if there's any things that stood out, and if there's any other resources, any other pieces that you think folks should know that can really help sort of move this needle on completion.
Thank you. Actually, I want to thank UCR for mentioning that they do have an HSI STEM grant from our office. This is actually the grant program that we will be competing this year. So a few of our bright spots mentioned research opportunities. In fact, the HSI STEM and Articulation Program grant is a perfect opportunity to help fund some of those experiences. This year we will be competing about $92 million, and we will be awarding approximately 109 grants. If you believe you are a Hispanic serving institution and want us to be sure to check your eligibility to make sure that in fact you are designated a Hispanic serving institution for 2016, keep in mind this is something that we vet annually, so you want to make sure that you are an HSI for 2016. We are more than happy to help you locate that information. Also, as I mentioned earlier, the Office of Postsecondary Education, specifically the Higher Education Programs Division, provides over $7 billion in funding for direct student support services as well as institutional improvements. We have a number of programs that do not require you to be designated as a Hispanic serving institution that will be competing this year. TRIO is one of the programs that will be competing. We have a number of other programs also that will have competitions. If you're interested in finding out whether or not you're eligible for any of these funding opportunities, as well as just get general information, you can always contact our office, as well as go to the Department of Education's website under funding forecasts. There you will see a number of funding opportunities, not just from Office of Postsecondary Education, but Office of Innovation and Improvement, as well as the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, which are great resources that can support a number of these initiatives.
Great, great. Thank you, B. I think that she shared, again, that just some of the great resources that are available that are useful. I'm sure the institutions of higher ed, but for other organizations are familiar with this, but for other organizations who may not be, there's also a portion of the U.S. Department of Ed's website that specifically focuses on student aid, federal student aid, and it's basically studentaid.ed.gov. And if you go to that website, you'll also sort of see that they're constantly updating information. There's videos, there's fact sheets, there's lots of information, because we know, as again, bringing it a little bit full circle, we know that funding for higher education, for post-secondary education, is a really critical need for a lot of our communities, a lot of the students in our communities, and so we definitely encourage you to take advantage of that, to look at the resources there, ways in which we can get information out into the hands of Latino students and families, help to dispel myths, and all those kinds of things. One last point I wanted to share is, before we conclude here today, is that we did get a comment from Twitter, which I think is worth mentioning, and food for thought, and that perhaps we can continue the conversation a little bit via social media, which is that it's also important. We've heard really tremendous ideas, tremendous experiences in practice, right, in terms of the work that institutions are doing, in terms of the work that organizations are doing, ways in which they've really achieved tremendous results with very few resources. But there's also an important need to think about the broader policy strategies, the broader policy ideas, which can really help to create that environment, to help smooth the way or reduce some of the challenges and the barriers that students face, or that even that institutions face in trying to support students adequately. And so one of the things we encourage you to share with us is your thoughts on those ideas, your input, so that we can share with our colleagues here at the U.S. Department of Education, at the White House Domestic Policy Council, about sort of policy solutions, policy changes that we need in order to help facilitate students. So with that, I think we're going to wrap up. I want to thank my colleague Biseja here. I want to thank all of the outstanding Bright Spot organizations who joined us today and who shared your expertise, your knowledge. And definitely want to thank everyone who's been watching the live stream. And we want to remind you that, again, these are some of our bright spots in Hispanic education that are absolutely doing tremendous work. But if you know of other groups that are doing good work to support educational attainment of Hispanics, and everything from cradle to career, from early childhood ed on through post-secondary and adult education, and everything in between, we'd love to hear about them. We're growing our Bright Spots in Hispanic Education catalog. There is an opportunity for folks to submit more organizations to be recognized, because, again, we want to really be able to give credit where it's due to the folks doing the outstanding work in local communities to help advance Latino academic achievement. So you can visit our webpage at ed.gov/Hispanic Initiative for further work about this initiative, to look at the full Bright Spots in Hispanic Education catalog, for how to nominate a new organization to be a Bright Spot. And in fact, soon you'll be able to go to our website and in fact find the recording of this Google Hangout. You'll be able to see this video and, more importantly, to share it with folks who weren't able to join us today with your colleagues, since, again, there's so much valuable information. And in fact, our entire series of Google Hangouts will be up as soon as they are ready. So please do check back on our website so that you can see that and share that information and get it out into even more hands and before more eyes. We look forward to our next Google Hangout conversation, which is going to take place on Wednesday, February 17th. We'll have a session conducted in Spanish this time with a group of Bright Spots who are doing great work to support family engagement in education for Latinos. So with that, thank you once again. Muchas gracias a todos. We look forward to talking to you again soon. And once again, thank you very much to our Bright Spots for not just sharing your knowledge and expertise today, but in fact for the great work that you do for so many students each and every day.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon.